time of year is when we see more representation of the North Pole than any other. Images of a pristine white snow evoke feelings of mystery, magic, but also of isolation and wilderness. The iconography associated with this time of year communicates a set of ideas about the North, both in terms of what is included and, more importantly, what is excluded. Although not malicious in its intent, our representation of the North is told through the lens of Southerners and leaves out the stories of Indigenous people of the region and their homelands. Hi, hello, and welcome to this episode of Geography Girl. Today we're diving into the identity of the Arctic and its representations from the South. We'll look at how the Arctic has become a region of geopolitical interest in the last 2 decades and why so many countries, some who don't even necessarily have proximity to the Arctic Circle, are now claiming Arctic identity. Representations of the Arctic are seen through the lens of Southerners. It's homogenous and Eurocentric and driven by a desire to exploit natural resources. But the North has a diverse and complexity in its demographic, culture and economy, and a resilient Indigenous community with a very sustainable lifestyle. The Canadian national anthem describes the country as the true North, strong and free. But what is the true North? Is there a distinct definition of the North? We can understand this through the characterizations of the environment. Arctic Focus helps us to understand the stereotypes of the North and what these mean. Stereotypical images include a landscape which is eternal and static. The White North is a characterization associated with winter views, seascapes, icebergs, following the rhythms of the sea and the sun. We see vast skies with aurora borealis, with notably humans absent. Images of the Inuit and other living organisms are relatively few compared to images of scenery and aspects of exploration. Characterizations of the environment and its people include terms such as primitive, noble, dangerous, and menacing, overwhelmingly white, empty, and desolate. There are more than 120,000 Inuit people across 40 different ethnic groups living in parts of Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Russia. For centuries, they have relied on their natural resources, strong leaders, tools, and skills to adapt to the environment of the Arctic North, surviving on fish, sea, whales, caribou, and walruses. In places like Canada, the government are now starting to formally recognise traditionally Indigenous regions, but perceptions of the Arctic and the people in the South are definitely American and Eurocentric. Much of our representation of the Arctic and its people who live there are of Santa Claus or a bunch of elves, and tales of Arctic exploration have captured the imagination of many. What marked the beginning of the cultural representation of the people and the environment of the Arctic and the subarctic is the search for the Northwest Passage. 400 years ago, explorers risked life and limb to search the Arctic for passage to the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Explorers were looking to build a strong trading route between Europe and Asia. Over the years, explorers would become stuck in sea ice, blocking channels between the Arctic islands and damaging ships, leading to starvation, scurvy, and cannibalism. Such explorers included Captain James Cook, who sailed through the Arctic on his very last voyage, being killed in Hawaii before he could return home, John Franklin, who attempted to cross the passage 3 times, killing 129 crewmen with 1 accused of cannibalism, and Robert McClure, who was the first explorer accredited to navigate the Northwest Passage, surviving 4 winters in the Arctic. In some lights, these characterizations are romantic, but it can also be seen as intellectual colonialism. The essay by Arctic Focus, The North, Frontier or Homeland, discusses these representations. The idea of a diverse people of the North as primitive is self-affirming and self-congratulatory construct, which places a Euro-American culture at the pinnacle of civilization. There is a sense of superior European technology compared to the inferior, inefficient, and incompetent Indigenous peoples. But European explorers in most cases did not survive without the assistance of Indigenous people. The Southern representation of Native people can be seen as a self-criticism to industrial society. Stereotypes tell us more about their makers than the Indigenous peoples themselves. The North, as dangerous and menacing, conveys the idea that death is synonymous with the idea of the North. Sir John Franklin's tragic expedition in 1845 and the resultant injury to British pride caused historians to emphasise the bravery of explorers. Representation of northern regions as empty lands and desolation serve a political purpose. After the loss of the Franklin exhibition, and then John Ray's report from the Inuit suggesting that the exhibition may have engaged in cannibalism, the Inuit were characterized as savages who could not be trusted, and their representations disappeared from the accounts of explorers. When claiming a discovered land for the empire, it becomes problematic if there are people living there. It therefore becomes better to ignore their presence, thus justifying the notion of empty lands. The Arctic is undergoing some interesting geopolitical shifts. It is considered as a space in rapid flux. Over the last decade, the number of Arctic interested states have increased dramatically. The Arctic Council has provided a forum for cooperation among Arctic states, including Indigenous groups, on issues like environmental protection and sustainable development. Rising geopolitical tensions, especially between Russia and Western nations, are straining collaborative spirit. Disputes over resources and military activities have the potential to increase regional tensions in the future. Arctic statehood itself is pretty contested. It's usually defined as geographical locations above the latitude of 66, 33, 39. One of the best examples of the contested quality of Arcticness is in the fact that almost the entirety of Iceland exists south of the Arctic Circle, apart from one small uninhabited island, yet has successfully branded itself as one of the most Arctic nations. The Finnish approach to the Arctic has been, according to Fadoush and Vatanen, playing a role of anticipation, developing and projecting a state identity. What drives Finland's vision to becoming an Arctic state involves placing a firm foothold of increasing their geopolitical importance in the region, but also in prioritising Finnish Arcticness in its foreign policy. Fadoush and Vatanen discuss the concept of an anticipatory state identity, which describes the gap between the state's imagination of itself in the future and how the imaginations are materialized and embedded within state policies through a repetition of narratives and discourses in the present. There is always the potential to reconfigure spaces and identities. Although Finland has existed as a sovereign state for more than 100 years, it only started identifying itself as an Arctic country at the turn of the millennium. State identity is enacted and iterated on a daily basis. It's performed through language, discourse, and media. State identity works on the history and the geography of the state. What is desired by state officials for many reasons may not be readily translated into a sense of belonging amongst the mass population. Therefore, we need to be cautious when comparing the concepts of an Arctic state with the reality of an Arctic nation. States such as US, Canada, Norway, and Iceland, and even a few with a territory beyond the Arctic Circle like China, Japan, and France, have put considerable efforts into developing an Arctic identity for themselves. These nations are all making claims to the Arctic seabed and the rights to the resources beneath it, particularly around the North Pole. These claims are based on interpretations of the United Nations Convention of the Law and Sea, which allows countries to extend their claims if they can prove their continental shelf extends into the Arctic. Scotland itself is turning to the geopolitical significance of being the world's most northerly non-Arctic nation. There are many reasons for this, but one theory is the pursuit of ontological security, which is the management and minimization of a state anxiety about who it is to itself and others. It is a response to the idea of physical security. Through an informal diplomacy, Scotland is able to deepen its Arctic association and strengthen its ontological security, therefore prioritizing its survival and developing a state identity which is stable. So why is the Arctic a geopolitical hotspot? The first is resource wealth. The Arctic is estimated to hold around 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of its natural gas. With global demand for these resources persisting, countries like Russia, the US, and Canada are all keen to tap into these reserves. And with the ice melting, energy exploration and extraction is getting easier. The area is rich in minerals such as nickel, copper, and even diamonds, making it attractive for mining operations. It also will provide new shipping routes. As the Arctic Sea melts, new shipping lanes like the Northern Sea Route, which is along Russia's northern coast, and the Northwest Passage, which is through Canada's Arctic archipelago, are becoming more accessible. These routes will significantly reduce travel distances between Europe, North America, and Asia compared to the traditional routes through the Suez or Panama canals. Control over these routes may provide economic and strategic advantages. Russia, for example, has been expanding its Arctic infrastructure and military presence to control access to the Northern Sea Route. There is a military build-up. As the region becomes more accessible, countries are reinforcing their military presence to secure their interests. Russia has reopened Cold War-era military bases and deployed advanced weapon systems in the Arctic. NATO allies have responded to increase their military capabilities, using the Arctic to create a buffer zone between themselves and Russia. By controlling parts of the Arctic, these nations will have an advantage in terms of surveillance, early warning systems, and military mobility. The Arctic is a critical region for understanding global climate change. Countries, as well as international organisations, are interested in conducting research in the Arctic to better understand climate dynamics. This interest can sometimes intersect with strategic and resource-based interests, as countries aim to bolster their scientific presence to strengthen their territorial claims. Although not geographically an Arctic state, China has now declared itself a near-Arctic state and has become increasingly active in the region. China's interests include scientific research, investment in Arctic infrastructure, and access to new shipping routes. Its involvement is seen as part of a global broader strategy to expand its influence. The Arctic has been included in China's Belt and Road Initiative under the concept of the Polar Silk Road, which will integrate the Arctic into its global trade networks. This has raised concerns amongst other Arctic nations about China's long-term strategic ambitions in the region. Many of the Arctic's indigenous communities depend on the region's natural resources for their livelihoods, and their lands are often central to the claims being made by Arctic countries. There is a growing recognition of their rights and knowledge that needs to be integrated into regional policies. As well as this, infrastructure like roads, ports, airships, and other economic opportunities are coming to these remote communities. Countries need to balance the pursuit of economic opportunities with the protection of indigenous rights and traditional ways of life. There is so much to be seen in the Arctic region in coming decades, and whilst our eyes are being drawn to the region more and more, it's important that we don't overlook the indigenous communities that have shaped and been shaped by the Arctic region. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please let me know your thoughts. And yeah, if you like this episode, please hit the like and subscribe button. I release new episodes every Tuesday. All right, that is it for this week, and I'll see you next time.